I would like to welcome you. My name is Kevin Wooten. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer here at the University of Houston at Clear Lake, and I would like to welcome you to the President's Speaker Series. This is our inaugural season for framing very interesting topics to connect with our community involving what we consider to be the big questions. This particular year, we're focusing on how do we prepare for the future of higher education. We have a great day lined up with you. I'm so honored to have as my co-host Dr. Lisa Jones, who is a professor of multicultural education. And in a moment, she'll be introducing our very special guest, Dr. Anderson. Just to let you know a little bit about the flow of today, this morning we will kick the program off with a presentation by Dr. Anderson, and it is entitled Transforming Higher Education, Understanding Diversity, Inclusion, and a Global Perspective in the Classroom. So that will be our first webinar this morning. And after a brief intermission at 10:30, we'll pick up with an educator's workshop, which is entitled Living Up to Our Promise of Change. Now at 12:30, we'll have the opportunity, of course, to have you as participants, and we're so glad to have you join us, to have some one-on-one time and to have some more direct interaction as we will have a virtual reception for Dr. Anderson. So we have a tremendous day lined up for you. We're so glad that you are able to join us. So before we begin and before I turn the program over to Dr. Jones, let me first ask Mr. Reggie Jones from our U of H Clear Lake Alumni Office, and today our technical host, to cover just a few housekeeping items. So Reggie, if you will.
Thank you, Dr. Wooten. Good morning, everybody. My name is Reggie Jones, and I will be serving as tech support for this webinar. All the attendees viewing the webinar are muted. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. We will use the last 15 minutes of the presentation to answer questions, to ask questions to the panelists. Questions will be answered in the order of their receipt and read to the panelists for their response. We will try to get as many questions answered live. However, in the event we are unable to answer during the webinar, we will email you a response. The ability to post questions anonymously has been disabled. Once a question has been answered, it will become visible to you by selecting the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. The chat feature has been disabled for this webinar as well. Please use the Q&A feature instead. Finally, the raise hand feature should be used in the event you would like to be unmuted. The time to use the raise your hand feature will occur during the final 15 minutes Q&A session at the end. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website next week. If you experience any technical issues during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature and notify us. Dr. Wooten?
Yes, thank you, Reggie. Before we kick the program off in earnest, we would like to share with you some information about the University of Houston Clear Lake and also provide you a welcome from our president, Dr. Ira K. Blake. So Reggie, if you would go ahead with the videos, please.
With more than 45 years of educating leaders and innovators in the nation's fourth largest and most diverse city, University of Houston Clear Lake is the place to launch the future. The university is uniquely embedded in the city's hub for technology and petrochemical industries, located minutes from NASA Johnson Space Center. Through powerful educational experiences and strong partnerships with alumni and community leaders, UHCL continues to make an impact. Campus locations in Clear Lake, Pearland, and the Texas Medical Center keep UHCL connected to Houston's thriving business and medical communities. More than 90 degree programs have propelled our 73,000 alumni to become CEOs, entrepreneurs, educators, astronauts, scientists, and community leaders. The best part? We are just getting started. We are moving confidently into the future with a new mission and vision that will be key to transforming lives, communities, and the world.
Greetings and welcome. I am Dr. Ira K. Blake, President of the University of Houston Clear Lake. Welcome to our inaugural Big Questions speaker series. This will be a speaker series unlike others, as our objective is to create a network of individuals, organizations, scholars, and communities who aspire to clearly define and address issues that impact our collective future. We seek to both educate and mobilize community involvement by helping to translate our shared understanding of critical challenges and opportunities. One objective will be to collaboratively generate options and pragmatic plans for us all. We will work with the following assumptions. We live in unparalleled times, with many intersectional questions facing us that are economic, political, social, and health related. We are all looking to understand our own condition and to better understand our world. The Big Questions speaker series will help us all decide what the real questions are and where we should focus our search for solutions. As a public regional university in the fourth largest and most diverse city in the United States, Clear Lake is in a unique position to accomplish this work. Where technology meets human ingenuity, we are next door to NASA, adjacent to the nation's largest petrochemical corridor. And we've added 2 educational sites, one in the nation's largest and premier medical complex, the Texas Medical Center, and another in one of the nation's fastest growing diverse communities, the city of Pearland. So, what do we do with this opportunity? I feel strongly that Clear Lake is poised to become not only a nationally prominent university, but also a regional and national thought leader. We can become a thought leader by providing authoritative perspectives on the real issues of the day that can raise consciousness on our campus and in our region. So, our inaugural speaker series will be devoted to the future of higher education and will feature nationally prominent futurists who will lead a day-long series of panels, presentations, and workshops as we address the big questions of how do we prepare for the future of higher education. Later this fall, we will examine how higher education must transform its overall diversity, inclusion, and global perspectives. Again, we will provide world-class authorities on framing and addressing this critical issue. At Clear Lake, we want not only to provide a forum for learning and exploring, but also to connect constituents and community groups throughout the region and the country to collaborate in addressing big questions. We are the type of university that not only seeks to ask the right questions, but also to leverage partnerships to find comprehensive solutions. If we as an institution help frame these questions and work collaboratively with others to address big questions, then we will take another step closer to fulfilling our vision. In closing, let me again welcome you to this series. We hope you find great value in our efforts. More importantly, we hope to partner with you in changing our world.
Thank you, Dr. Blake. So I think we need to go ahead and begin our program. So I'd like to turn the program over to today's co-host, Dr. Lisa Jones. Lisa, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Wooten, and good morning, everyone. It is so wonderful to see all of you, and we're so delighted that you are joining us for our second President's Speaker Series. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our special guest today, Dr. James Anderson. Dr. James A. Anderson earned a doctoral degree in cognitive psychology from Cornell University in New York. He served as a chancellor and professor of psychology at Fayetteville State University from June 2008 until July 2020. He has also served as a faculty member and in high-level administrative positions at the University at Albany, New York, Texas A&M University, and North Carolina State University, just to name a few. Dr. Anderson has consulted with over 350 colleges and university systems, including the University of Texas system, addressing topics such as teaching effectiveness, student retention and persistence, the assessment of student learning and diversity, institutional diversity plans, faculty development, and the institutional preparation for SACS accreditation. He is the author of several books, including The Unfinished Agenda, Brown versus the Board of Education, and Driving Change Through Diversity and Globalization, Transformative Leadership in the Academy. An extensive bio has been provided to the university so that you can view all of Dr. Anderson's tremendous achievements. So welcome, Dr. Anderson. We will now turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. It is an honor to have been selected to be part of the President's Speaker Series. I think President Blake is the right person to lead this initiative, lead this campus-wide effort, and it'll pay off down the road. You are to be lauded for the fact that you are thinking about your future. Why? Because the state of Texas is working on its 2036 initiative. And that is being led by Margaret Spellings. And Margaret was my boss when she headed up the University of North Carolina system. And she left and came back to Texas where she was before, and now is leading the 2036 initiative. I have connected Margaret with President Blake because I think that what you're doing right now can make you a demonstration campus in terms of thinking about the future. So hopefully the connection between President Blake and Margaret Spellings will lead to that kind of outcome. Of course, almost everything that I say today and what the future has said in the last speaker series has been affected by COVID-19. There's just no way around it. And so a lot of the things that we say and do, we have to keep that in the back of our mind. I want to provide you with a lot of information today. And as Kevin said, it will be posted, I think. But I'm also leaving all the slides, all the PowerPoints with him. And it's yours. Everything you see today is yours. And you can request it, any of the slides from him, or he can post it. You will see that I put a lot of emphasis on questions. And you heard President Blake say in her introduction that it's important to state what questions you are addressing as an institution and to select the right questions. A lot of institutions have selected questions that led them down the road for a few years. And as it turns out, it wasn't the right question. And so they suffered financially and they suffered reputationally in other ways because they selected the wrong questions. So you will see I ask a lot of questions and I focus on outcomes. That is, you have to have measurable outcomes of your success, and your answers to questions have to be restated in the form of outcomes. I want you all to understand that down the road, your most visible successes will probably be long-term. You can have less visible successes that are short-term, but it's the long-term ones that you're really pointing towards. And a great example of that is an institution that I mention all the time who's done it right, and that's Georgia State University in Atlanta. You know, Georgia State, when you look at that institution in terms of diversity and inclusion and globalism and other things, equity, spent a lot of years in the weeds. You didn't hear much about them. And then all of a sudden, in the last, let's say, 8 to 10 years, you know that Georgia State now, because of its leadership and because of its commitment and being in Atlanta and being in Georgia, that Georgia State has done that. So I use that only to say that a lot of their successes were less visible, but right now you can see that they are more visible. Some faculty believe that the discussion of diversity, inclusion, globalism, equity is not appropriate for their discipline. I don't believe that. First of all, such faculty are not student-centered faculty, because if you're a student-centered faculty member, you understand two things. One, that students spend most of their time with you during their tenure at an institution. And two, you're in Texas and you're in that Southwest region of the United States. So students are diverse. And so because they're diverse, you need to think about how can I take my content and really address it in a way that diverse students can become successful in my classroom. Expose yourself to as much information as you can that's out there. Texas A&M has a series of books it produced called Black Texicans, European Texicans, Asian Texicans, Mexican Texicans. It doesn't sound like you know that makes sense, Mexican Texicans, but it does. And all of those books talk about who came first to Texas and how they fit in. So that would be a great starting place for anyone, especially students. Lastly, at some point, you have to address social justice. And again, you can adjust it in terms of a long-term commitment and a short-term. When I first got to Fayetteville State as chancellor, I got involved with the community, and I found that one of their big complaints was that the community around FSU was in a food desert. And so I said, down the road, we have to address that. We have to do things now, and we have to try to get a supermarket chain to come to this area. Well, the first two things I did was create a farmer's market where the farmers in North Carolina could bring their fresh produce and everything else. And it was held every Wednesday all day, and people would come to the farmer's market. But I also learned that many of our students were not wealthy, and they needed a food pantry. And so they could come once a week to the food pantry, and we got some of the grocery stores in the area to contribute food. We got people at the university to contribute food, and students could come to the food pantry. So notice the food pantry and the farmer's market preceded trying to get a large grocery store change, okay? So think that way, that you will have to address smaller things sometimes before you get to the big thing. All right, may I have the first slide, please? Okay, in our discussions about diversity, inclusion, equity, globalism, et cetera, there's the historical frame of reference that we have used. Diversity has often been talked about in terms of demographic differences, has been applied to enrollment of students of color, has been applied to making sure we have more faculty, things like that. Inclusion has to do with the visible representation of groups and symbols, et cetera. Strategic priorities in your plan, how you make decisions on your campus. Who makes decisions on your campus? Are there people of color or women? I don't want to leave gender out of this discussion. Are there people of color or women who are in strong decision-making positions? And then equity has to do with the fair and equal treatment of diverse groups across different areas, academic, co-curricular, employment, salary. Every university should do a salary equity study. And if you do, you will probably find that women are paid less, women professors are paid less than male professors, and they're in the same position. May have equal credentials, may produce just as much research, but they're still paid less. Next, please. As we talk about different groups, especially student groups, each group has diversity within the group, and then there's diversity between the groups. So as I said, diversity can be talked about in terms of demographic, descriptive kind of characteristics, but also some social and human relational skills and characteristics. The big one for me is learning styles, learning strategies, and task completion skills. That was my focus in my dissertation. We can look at within any group, women, African Americans, Hispanic students. We can look at psychological characteristics. We can look at non-cognitive factors. One of the things I did at Fayetteville State University was I asked everyone who was dealing with retention and persistence to produce an article that they would submit to a journal. I wanted the quality to be scholarly, and I wanted them to dump all of the characteristics that we collect when students come, not only demographic characteristics, but any psychological characteristics that we assess. I wanted them to dump it all into an analysis using analytics. The thing that we came up with that seems to affect student success the most is academic self-confidence. Well, guess what? There are not a lot of good assessments of academic self-confidence. So we had to develop our own. Information processing skills, which has a lot to do with how students read the textbook, how students sit in lectures and take information in. And the third big one now is how they look at the computer and learn and assess information. And then lastly is competencies in critical literacy skills. I like to say to faculty, you think you're teaching critical thinking? I said, well, think about it. The only ways that we know that students are developing critical thinking is through writing and speaking. I mean, we could give them a critical thinking assessment, but that's not necessarily geared towards what you do in your classroom. So if you don't have students writing critically or giving critical presentations, then you probably are not going to be able to assess critical thinking well. Next slide, please. This is just a kind of matrix that looks at what I just said. And that is, when you think about a classroom is composed of the instructor's instructional style, and then how the classroom is set up in terms of internal dynamics. Well, as we look at different kinds of students, or even instructors, for example, I like to say that most STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, most STEM instructors, or any instructor who deals with abstract course content, okay? So that could be philosophy, accounting, abstract course content, right? Most of those professors are analytical thinkers. And if you're an analytical thinker, you most likely are going to be an analytical instructor. But suppose half of your class has not reached that level of analytical development yet, and they're going to struggle in your class. So you need to make sure that in terms of your teaching style, you clearly understand the learning styles of and preferred strategies of most of the students who come to University of Houston Clear Lake, and the ones that will come in the future, because we all know that diversity is going to dominate enrollment down the road, not only just of students of color, but there will be more non-traditional students, older students, et cetera. So faculty will have to adjust their instructional styles to meet that. The arrows going different ways simply mean that the instructional style in the classroom can affect how students process information if it's set up right. It can affect moving students from a learning style that's dysfunctional or not successful in a classroom to one that is successful. And I'll talk a little later about the success we've had at the University of Michigan College of Engineering, where students of color were not performing well there. Even though they came in with the same credentials as many of the white students, they just weren't performing well. And that's because they were using the inappropriate learning style, inappropriate learning strategies, and we corrected that. So that's, again, just a visible graphic representation of what I was talking about. Next, please. Okay, now globalism, even though it's on a separate slide, globalism is still connected to this conversation. Globalism refers to the values, how we think about globalism, how we defined it. It's connected to culture and religion, different trends, and it's often associated with liberal learning outcomes that are cross-disciplinary. As you know, the liberal learning outcomes sometimes are challenged by groups as not really being functional for campuses or not being functional for certain disciplines, okay? And liberal learning is often, thought of in terms of political correctness, even though it shouldn't be. So we have to make sure that how we talk about globalism, global learning, global teaching, et cetera, research even, that we articulate it as a true goal of undergraduate education, graduate education, faculty research, et cetera. When you look at yourself, when you do an introspective examination of what you're doing as an institution, does the general ed curriculum include global perspectives that are intentional, comparative, thought-provoking, and are both political and apolitical, okay? We have a chance now, because of the divisiveness in our country, to look at things in a way that are both political and apolitical, okay? We have a chance to see whether or not, as an institution, if what we're doing is intentional, that it's based upon what we want to accomplish, outcomes, in other words, that is thought-provoking, that it excites students, etc. We also need to look at the collaborative activities that we have with other institutions, both in this country and other institutions globally. It might be that the global connections that we have fall under a category of internationalism, more so than globalism. And so that's why you have a separate international programs office on your campus. You have separate administrators, you have faculty who are involved with that international programs office, et cetera. And none of this spills over into the curriculum or into the undergraduate experience. So it really benefits the faculty and other individuals who are involved in international programs, but doesn't benefit necessarily our students or what our goals are for undergraduate education, okay? And then, of course, pragmatically, we need to address how a global focus is rewarded. So if we ask faculty to take on globalism as a institutional goal and a goal in their classroom in terms of student learning, how will they be rewarded? When they come up for promotion and tenure, is that going to be included in their portfolio and honestly looked at as a benefit, okay, for them in the promotion and tenure process? If that's not the case, then you are really putting those faculty members behind the eight ball in terms of why they, motivationally, why they should be committed to this, okay? It's something that takes a lot of discussion because of how governance and teaching and learning and research are rewarded on a campus. There's always a imbalance on most campuses between teaching, research, service, et cetera. And so you need to make sure, not just University of Houston, Clear Lake, but anyone listening to this, you need to make sure that at your institution, that we very specifically and publicly talk about how this is going to be rewarded when faculty take it on. Next one, please. Okay. Your last presentation in the speaker series had to do with the future. So let's talk a little bit about the future. So the conversations that we have now are going to become more political. The conversations we have about anything are going to become more political, as you can see from what's going on in this country. But our conversations about diversity, inclusion, globalism, equity, et cetera, are going to become more political on our campuses. And secondly, we need to think more about how our programs contribute to the employability of our students. And we have to do it in a more rigorous way. Campuses that still have a career center office where students go and try to look for employment in their junior and senior years is passé. Okay, you need to get rid of it. What you need to do is put it into academic programs so that as a student makes a journey through its major, minor, et cetera, the student will be exposed to information that will tell them why this information is going to contribute down the road to increasing their chances to be employed, okay? I shared with Kevin, one of my colleagues has developed an assessment instrument called Career Match IQ. And to me, it's one of the better instruments because it takes into account a large number of student factors. And an employer, for example, could take the results of the Career Match IQ and look at these students across multiple dimensions and see how they match up with what's going on in their company, in their corporation, et cetera. Even graduate schools could take that information and look at it. Another thing that we know is going to happen in the future is there are going to be more challenges to ethnic and gender-based curriculums, scholarships, et cetera. And, in a lot of states, in North Carolina, for example, in Texas to some degree, you cannot have race-based scholarships anymore, okay? They'll be challenged. As you know, in the next bullet, you're gonna have more legal challenges to enrollment by whites, to scholarships, et cetera, who are denied admission. And you know what's really funny about that is the challenges that these students make. And the two big ones have been white females at the University of Michigan and at, I think, the University of Texas. They were, first of all, rejected for enrollment based on whatever the general characteristics were that were being used for enrollment. They weren't rejected initially because of a comparison to minority students. They just were not found to be able and be successful to get into the university, okay? When that happened, then these plaintiffs said, well, I didn't get in because of, you know, what's going on with minority enrollment. But that's not how you were first analyzed in terms of your enrollment credentials. Your enrollment credentials were those that every other student, white, African-American, Mexican, that's how you were first looked at. But when I was at Texas A&M, this became an issue. And the students, the board, the system, Texas A&M system, et cetera, wanted us to remove race as a consideration. Now, race was one of 8 or 9 characteristics, okay, as it is on many campuses, but it's the weight you give to race that becomes the issue. So what we said to them was, well, if race is an unfair consideration, that is, it puts students of color, puts minorities in a position that gives them an advantage, well, so does legacy, okay? So we're willing to remove race as a consideration if you remove legacy, okay? Why should a student be given the unfair advantage of being admitted because their grandfather, their father, other relatives went to that institution, okay? Especially if that student has a weak profile coming in. Guess what? They agreed to that. They agreed to do that. And you might say now, well, if you remove race, what do you replace it with? We replaced it with geographical factors. That is, we said, let's look at areas of Texas where we haven't really engaged in an effort to enroll students. And what are those areas of Texas? Many of them are areas where minorities populate. Okay, so geographical analysis of enrollment kind of replaced race and was successful, okay? 2 bullets down, you're gonna see more of a demand for inclusion by LGBTQ community. They are going to want more things from us on our campus. When I got there as chancellor, there was nothing. And the LGBTQ community came to me and said, look, we want more inclusion in things on campus. I said, okay. So I gave them a whole floor of a building. They had an office, but most importantly, they became part of the recognized student organizations, which means they could apply for money now. The recognized student organizations on campus could apply for money to do things. They did that. A faculty member stepped forward who was lesbian to lead that effort, et cetera. We had an increasing number of transgender students. And so that was one of the things that we said we needed to do to promote inclusion around sexuality, gender issues, et cetera. You'll see later that I will talk a little bit about sexual assault. But on our campuses now, what's happening nationally is that the sexual assault policies that we have on our campuses are being challenged. And in North Carolina, this is a major, major issue. And it started at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington campus, where several frat boys were accused of, frat men, excuse me, were accused of sexual assault of a female student. Well, one of the members of the board of trustees happened to be a member of that fraternity and brought forth the challenge to that sexual assault policy on that campus. And you will see now nationally that one of the big changes, and this is an important change, is that students, especially male students, who are charged with sexual assault can now question the plaintiff, can now, not just their lawyers in the past, it have been their lawyers who could question The plaintiff is usually the woman. But now the student themselves can do that. All right. Now, remember, these are students who don't have a legal background, who are going to challenge them. And a lot of the challenges are based upon the fact that the male will say it was consensual. Okay. So that's going to be a big issue, and we need to think about that. And then there's the increased expectations to address social justice issues. The Black Lives Matter movement has propelled that somewhat. The equal justice movement has propelled that somewhat, et cetera. So it's for institutions like the University of Houston Clear Lake to decide what social justice issues are important for you. And it may be that yours are different than some of the other schools in Texas. It might be that even on your campus, you have different disciplines, different programs, et cetera, having social justice issues. But I would suggest that, since your Big Questions initiative, presidential initiative, yours wanting to be a thought leader, you wanting to be a model for the nation, that there be at least one, maybe two social justice issues that are large issues that you can talk about in terms of institutional transformation for this issue. Okay. Now, it might be that Hispanic and Black students want it to be race. Okay. It might be. I'm not saying it is. It might be. It might be that somebody else wants it to be economic inequity in the communities, et cetera. So think about that for the future and begin to think in a way that you can decide on what you want to do. Also, the leadership in this discussion has to be very careful about how they present themselves when discussing these issues. And I'll give you a great example. One of the University of North Carolina campuses, we have 17 in the system. One of those were created to support Native American students because we have a region here in North Carolina that is populated by the Lumbee tribe. And that campus, even though it was created to support Native American students, it's really not doing that. Only about 10% of the students are Native American now. The other 40% are white and 40% Black or something like that. But what happened was at a Trump rally recently, the chancellor from University of Pembroke, he escorted one of the chiefs of the Lumbee tribe to that gathering, that Trump rally. Well, when the students found out, their contention was that he was at the rally to support Trump. And all the chancellors know in the UNC system, you're supposed to be apolitical. You're not supposed to show in any way any public demonstration of favorability for any candidate in any race, not just presidential race, Senate, it doesn't matter. The student Senate, the student organization, student body president has now demanded the resignation of that chancellor, who's really a good person. I like him a lot. He's done some good things, but he made a mistake in attending that Trump rally, even if it was to support one of the chiefs and the demands that the Lumbee tribe have been making to be recognized by the federal government. So our leaders have to be very careful when they're dealing with political issues or issues that potentially could be political. They need to be very careful as they do this. Next slide, please. Okay, again, let's talk a little bit more about the future. Your previous presentation in the speaker series was by futurists. And one of the things they talked a lot about how there's going to be disruption in the future, various forms of disruption. And as I state in that first bullet, disruption is going to cause things to change. But even though disruption may cause things to change, the politics of change may have a different impact on different groups, all right? And we have to be careful of that. What happens when in Texas, let's say, disruption impacts communities that are poor, that are of color, et cetera, and University of Houston Clear Lake or none of the University of Houston campuses say anything about it, okay? You don't address the politics of that disruption. Will disruption, COVID-19, look at the disruption COVID-19 has now produced, coronavirus has produced. Students who thrive in face-to-face settings in the classroom are now online. They feel distant. Many of them have social isolation, etc. And institutions aren't addressing that. They just put courses online, and faculty who have had no experience teaching courses online are now teaching courses online, okay? I would not expect certain categories of students to do that, but coronavirus caused a disruption. This disruption caused changes in how we do business now, not only at universities, but even at companies and corporations where people are working from home. But the impact on student groups is differential, and we have to account for that in terms of what we're doing. Who's going to impact this change and disruption? Well, historically marginalized and victimized groups have limited power and opportunity to change the way that disruption occurs. They're just disempowered. And so if they have no say in it, who's going to speak for them? Disruption may cause the loss of human talent because of the equities and isms, et cetera. And there's a lot of research that shows that that's the case. Later on, I'm going to present, not later on in this presentation, but later on, I think in another presentation, I'm going to present the cost, the actual dollar cost of discrimination. And you can see clearly that this has happened. That's a loss of talent and there's a cost. And we cannot also rule out the mental health costs associated with what happens with disruption. Now, in the last session that the futurists talked about, they said that we must consider more of an emphasis on two things. The impact of how work has changed, let's put it that way, and then life without work, okay? Well, in either case, if you talk about work in ways different now, it's gonna have a differential impact on groups whose sheer existence depends on work, like the service industry. Okay, when you listen to who's impacted more by the coronavirus, you always hear in every city that it's the service industry workers who are impacted more, okay? Why? Because their sheer existence depends on work. They're not entrepreneurs, they're not making investments, they're not getting money from investments, et cetera. These are people whose livelihood from check to check depends on work. So when I hear the futurists say we need to consider life without work, that's totally meaningless for these populations, okay? We have to do the opposite and make sure that their work becomes more meaningful, more substantive, more productive, more entrepreneurial, et cetera, and help them see that. Another thing that was mentioned was the impact of assumptions, that we make assumptions about certain things, and it's the assumptions and decisions about those assumptions that are a preparation for disruption. And again, I suggest that there's a differential impact because people of color, people in the lower rung economically, people who have not had the chance to have their voice heard politically, et cetera, that's going to cause a problem for them. One of the speakers gave the example of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And the speaker said one of the assumptions that was made was that the levees would hold if they have a Category 5 hurricane. Well, to me, that's not the important assumption. That is an assumption, okay? Yes, and it is important. You expect the levees to hold. You expect the engineers to be able to develop levees that will hold. But to me, the important assumption had to do with what will happen. What will happen in our city to people and to certain groups if the levees don't hold, okay? So all of those bodies of especially Black folk that you saw floating in the water, all of those people you saw sitting on roofs, all of those people you saw sitting on highways, et cetera, those were the ones that were most impacted by certain things, and we didn't make any assumptions. Was the French Quarter flooded and impacted? No. Was St. Charles Avenue, where all of the very nice houses sit, impacted? No. So there were different areas of New Orleans that were not impacted by Hurricane Katrina. Most of those were white. Most of those had to do with businesses. And it was the minority communities, Black and Hispanic and Vietnamese, because the Vietnamese are well represented in New Orleans now. Those were the ones that were impacted. So see, to me, making an assumption about the levies is the wrong assumption. It's what happens if the levies fail and who is affected when the levies fail. If that had been discussed, maybe there would have been better preparation for what happened with Katrina. Here's a second example of assumptions. So as an outcome of the coronavirus, we now know that about 3 million students are unaccounted for online, okay? K through 12 and at the university. 3 million are unaccounted for, okay? It's not that they're online and they're not participating regularly, it's they're unaccounted for. Most of those students are Black, brown, and poor, okay? So what does that mean? That means down the road that these students fall further behind in terms of their exposure to things like using technology, what artificial intelligence will mean in their life down the road, augmented realities, things like that. So those are the things that address college students. But in your future thinking, coronavirus is very, very important. And when I talked to the core leadership team this afternoon, that's one of the issues that I'm going to raise, is how the coronavirus can affect and will affect your future thinking as an institution. Okay, next, please. Okay, have you noticed that in the discussions about where institutions are headed, that the Board of Trustees are very seldom mentioned? Okay, and in fact, I asked a couple people at University of Houston Clear Lake that I've talked to, where's the Board of Trustees in terms of this discussion of diversity, equity, inclusion, globalism? Where are they? And every person I talked to said, I don't know. They haven't taken a position. Okay, well, maybe they need to. Senior leaders, faculty, etc., will take positions, but you can't leave the Board of Trustees out. One of the major impacts I had in my career was at the University of Wisconsin system. Okay, I was invited up to talk to the board, the system board. And before I came, the colleague who invited me said, James, these are all white men, conservative Republicans. Okay. Now I'm not mentioning demographically who they were in a negative way. I'm just saying that's who it was. They were white male conservative Republicans. Well, I figured out going up there talking about race and gender and all this other stuff would be meaningless to them. Okay, that they're not going to make changes. So I got up there and I talked to them about white students in Wisconsin. I said, don't you want white students in Wisconsin who leave their various institutions here, the system institutions, don't you want them to be competitive in the global workplace? And then they'll come back to Wisconsin and do X and do Y and have money to pay taxes and do things like that. At the end of my 2-hour presentation, the chair of the board said, this is the first and only presentation I've ever heard on diversity that I can buy into. He said, because I wasn't being beaten over the head by race. I wasn't being beaten over the head, by transgender, sexuality, etc. It was that you focused on who most of these students are in Wisconsin. You got to remember, in Wisconsin, if you take Milwaukee out and maybe Madison, where a lot of folks go to University of Wisconsin, if you take those two out, there's not many folks of color in Wisconsin. So it would have been dumb for me to go up there and try to make race such a big issue. Another issue that has arisen, and I bring this up because I had to contend with the University of North Carolina Board of Governors. So the Board of Governors oversee the 17 institutions, and every chancellor reports to those Board of Governors. And periodically when they had meetings, and their meetings were always public, they were always televised, you had 2 or 3 members of this board talk about these liberal ideologies and how they were connected to discussions about diversity, inclusion, et cetera. And what it was doing was unfairly indoctrinating students in the University of North Carolina system. Moreover, it wasn't giving attention to conservative viewpoints like it should. Well, I asked Margaret Spellings, could I do a presentation one day? Okay, and I mentioned this in my book. And if you think about this discussion it was based upon David Horowitz's Academic Bill of Rights, which was developed in the 1950s at Columbia University, which is surprising because in the 1950s at Columbia, there were almost no students of color and few women. Okay, so David Horowitz was taking on an issue that wasn't even represented on his campus. And what he said was that these positions on diversity, inclusion, all that, you know, they're not allowing the conservative ideology and the conservative beliefs to be covered in the academic content. And so hence students are being the right to explore conservative positions, and the state legislature, have introduced bills to support the academic bills right. Well, do your homework. If you look at all of the states where the Academic Bill of Rights have been introduced by the legislature, they failed in almost every state, okay? If you do surveys on campus and you ask students, in all the classes you've taken, have you noticed that the conservative ideology has been underrepresented? Overwhelmingly, the students say no. In fact, the only students who reply that happens are conservative students who are a member of conservative organizations, okay? So when I was at Texas A&M, I said, let me see if this is the case here. So I did an examination asking students whether or not there was an imbalance in the curriculum. That is, are faculty giving more attention, is the university giving more attention to liberal considerations, diversity and inclusion and globalism, all that, and you're really not being exposed to conservative ideologies? Again, most of the students said no. They said faculty are pretty fair in their coverage of what they're talking about, et cetera. The only students who responded yes were students who were part of the conservative students of Texas, for example. And so don't fall for that. That's why you got to know the research. That's why you have to know what you're doing. Well, since I challenged the Board of Governors publicly, presented an evidence-based argument that says what you're talking about isn't true, you do know now that those 3 or 4 Board of Governor members who had been positing this were never going to forgive me for doing that because it was on TV, okay? It was on TV all around North Carolina. So they never forgave me for that, embarrassing them, I guess. But you know, the research is what the research says. Nothing you can do about that. So part of being a leader in this discussion is being willing to take on things like that when they occur. Next slide, please. Let me see how my time is. Okay. All right. Oh, this is what I was talking about, that the reality of the Academic Bill of Rights was that it failed when it came into community surveys. Even faculty who supports Horowitz's position, even faculty, and there were a lot of them, for example, at Texas A&M when I was there, even those faculty who supported Horowitz's position about not including enough about the conservative point of view, even they can't generate any evidence to support the conservative agenda. So it's not only that students don't favor it, it's that faculty who favor it cannot produce any evidence. That is true. All right, next slide, please. Okay. I'm going to talk, and I've been talking a lot about leadership, not just President Blake and the core leadership team, but throughout the organization. Any person who's in a position of leadership, any manager who's in a position of leadership, et cetera, has to present the position of the University of Houston Clear Lake, once you establish that position about diversity, inclusion, equity, globalism. Once you establish that position, I'm sorry for that misspelling up there, considerations for campus. You know, the O is next to the P on the keyboard. So leaders need to do a couple things. First of all, avoid abstract language and ambiguous meanings about institutional change, institutional transformation, not just about diversity, globalism, et cetera, but about anything else, okay? Just be totally clear about what you're doing, why you're doing it, what it's gonna mean if you do it, et cetera. Give you an example. So when I first got to Fayetteville State, there were 3 or 4 issues that had to be addressed right then and there. One was the closing down of the nursing program. The state nursing board had decided that they were going to close down the nursing program because it wasn't productive. Okay. And they were in the newspaper all the time as being a failure and this and that, da, da, da. So I went up to the board and I said, give me 1 year. Give me 1 year to change this. And I went in and I got rid of the chair, got rid of most of the faculty, et cetera, and rebuilt the nursing program. And then from that point on, everything the nursing program did was talked about forthright. There was no abstract language, no abstract meaning, et cetera. So transformation occurred, but all through the time I was doing it, even when I first got up publicly and said, we're going to change the nursing program. Here's why we're doing it. Here's where we want to go. And I actually said, and we're going to become in a few years the #1 nursing program in the country. Now, that's a bold statement to make as a leader. Go to nursejournal.com and you will see the country's divided in half in nursejournal.com, the East and the West, and of about 1,300 nursing programs in the East, we're #2. All right. So I projected what goes into having a strong nursing program. I talked about it consistently, so no one ever could say we didn't know what he was doing, et cetera. All right, next, second point. We have to identify those structures on our campuses that as we think about the future, what structures and what policies can drag what we're doing along with them. That is, the ones that exist, that are good, that are powerful, the regulations, et cetera, that we can use to build on to drag us into the future, as opposed to those that are non-functional, okay? Here's an example. So I get to Fayetteville State and the policy on withdrawals. So you want to connect student persistence, student retention of diverse students, okay, to academic success, course completion, et cetera. You want to connect those two. Well, I get to Fayetteville State and I find out that in terms of student withdrawals, that students can use as many withdrawals as they want throughout their career. Moreover, they could withdraw all the way up to 2 weeks before the end of the semester. I said, so you're telling me that all students who have D's and F's in courses 2 weeks before the semester can withdraw, okay? Because they have unlimited withdrawals. You see, that's not something that can drag along retention and persistence of students of color because it allows them to escape. It was an escape route for students who aren't performing well, who don't go to class, et cetera. And I said, no more, no more. We're not gonna do that. We're only gonna allow students 5 withdrawals in their entire undergraduate career. So they need to think about which ones they're gonna do. So we went from unlimited withdrawals to 5 withdrawals. Guess what? It made a world of difference. Third point, be attentive to the macro and micro analyses that we do, okay? And that kind of lines up to some degree with the long-term, short-term thing I talked about. So a macro analysis of something is different than perhaps a micro analysis. The macro analysis is a broad, thorough, analytical analysis, let's say of the institution, of a department, academic department, of a college, okay? Whereas a microanalysis might be something that a program in student affairs does, okay? Something like that. Let me use my experience at the University of Albany, State University of New York in Albany. There was a, let's see, a controversial relationship. I'm gonna choose my words wisely. There was a controversial relationship between Jewish students and Muslim students, but it wasn't all Muslim students. It was the Jewish students who identified with being Zionist, okay? Who kind of are an extreme wing of the Jewish students. And one of the things they were doing to Muslim students, anytime the Muslim students had a meeting or some gathering, speakers, et cetera, the Zionist students would run through the event screaming about the event, how the event was unfair, how Muslims were racist, how this. So I said, we got to put a stop to this. See, so I applied a micro analysis to a problem that affected two student groups. And one of the things I said was, let's have the students debate each other on these issues. Let's have a formal debate and let's invite people to come to the debate. But here's the catch. Whoever the debaters are for Muslim students and whoever the debaters are for the Jewish students, you have to take the position of the other group. So as you debate, if you're a Muslim student, as you debate, you have to debate as if you were a Jewish student. Here are the reasons, that support what we do. and the opposite was true of the Jewish students. They had to take the Muslim position. Well, the first year we did it, we had maybe 200 or 300 people come. By the third year, we had to move it to the gym because we had about 2,000 people come, not just from the campus. They were coming from the community. They heard about these debates and everything. And we were able to develop a debate program, which we didn't have before that for undergraduates. All right. All of that happened from a micro analysis of a particular problem. Right. A macro analysis at University of Albany was that there were only a small number of students of color involved in undergraduate research, okay? And so in the next session, I'm gonna give an example of one instructor there that I supported more than anyone else because she built into her coursework how to deal with this issue of students in undergraduate diverse students not being accounted for in undergraduate research, okay? Fourth point, leaders should analyze in depth several institutions where transformation has been implemented. I gave you one, Georgia State, okay? You wanna look at somebody who's doing things right, look at Georgia State, okay? As a leader, plan your responses a priori to any external pressure. So Kevin, the position you're in, Reggie, the position you're in, Richardson, the position you're in, okay, you're going to have external pressures often from outside forces, whether they agree or disagree about your decisions. So you might have some Black Lives Matter folks who say, you're not doing something strong enough. You're not representing it well. You might have some other students who take the opposite position. You're giving too much attention to this, through this diversity and inclusion stuff, you're giving too much attention to X. Well, you have to think about a priori before this happens, what your response is going to be. Okay, if you know you're going to get beat up for something, know what your response is going to be. Okay, this was really true when I was at Texas A&M, when I supported certain groups, like I supported female students in around some certain things, I supported LGBTQ students around certain things, etc. I knew I was going to be attacked by the conservative Christian students at Texas A&M. I thought about that. I thought about the arguments I was going to use. I thought about showing them how they, as students, how the conservative students were going to benefit from learning about these things, that when they got into discussions down the road, if they graduate and they move on to somewhere up north or the Midwest, et cetera, they have to be able to discuss these issues in a way that makes sense. How do I know they couldn't do it? Well, when I met with some of the students, the Black and Hispanic student organizations, I asked them a simple question. I said, tell me about Rush Limbaugh. The best response I got from both groups was, man, that dude is racist. That's not a well thought out analytical response, okay? Rush Limbaugh, the most powerful figure in the media representing the conservative platform, and all they could say, man, that dude is racist, okay? So I said, I need to prepare these students to be able to contend with the pressures that come from having to argue that maybe, I say maybe because there's somebody listening to this, maybe a Rush Limbaugh supporter, maybe Rush Limbaugh isn't the best person to represent the conservative position, okay? So think about that. Think about, Richardson and Kevin and the rest of y'all, Lisa, think about, as we go into the future, the big questions we're going to put forward, which ones are most likely going to receive pushback? And how should we be prepared to discuss that pushback? Okay. Okay, if the provost is listening or chief academic officer is listening, I'm gonna put responsibility on you, okay? Special attention must be paid to the role and responsibilities of the chief academic officer, the associate academic officers, et cetera, the deans, the faculty. Why? Because I'm a big proponent of intellectual diversity and inclusion and globalism and equity. That is, I'm gonna be honest, I've know most institutions in the country, 2-year, 4-year, who are involved in diversity efforts. I don't know any that have been successful if they haven't addressed the intellectual aspect. Here's another way of saying it. Maybe the true impact of diversity on your campus is what's the impact on white students? We're always looking at the impact on students of color, okay? Maybe the issue is when white students walk across the stage, how have we changed their thinking? How have they grown in their own major and in their own discipline? Okay, that's the intellectual. If you want to say students who leave University of Houston Clear Lake are better critical thinkers, can better analyze tough issues in this country and tough issues in the world, you know, like why are South Korea and North Korea at odds? You know, that's going to take an analysis, right, to do that. So it's the responsibility of the chief academic officer to make sure that downline, the different individuals who report to him or her are doing the things in a way that's going to have the impact that Houston wants. So as the president talked about, we want to be a thought leader. You can't be a thought leader if you're not introducing intellectual things, okay? Well, that's what being a thought leader means, okay? Thought leader doesn't mean, you know, we got 20% more of this group in the faculty now. That's not being a thought leader, okay? That's you just hire more faculty, and maybe many of those faculty don't want to deal with diverse students, okay? If it wasn't in their job description, why do they have to do it, okay? So being a thought leader to me means certain cognitive intellectual things. And so the discussion about diversity, inclusion, globalism, and equity should be represented intellectually, which also means they have to be evidence-based. You have to decide as you're thinking about all of this in the future, what parts of this do you want to be scholarly? What parts do you want to be evidence-based, et cetera? Next slide. Okay. Again, more competing demands. I've talked about a few of them, but here's some more competing demands. And I do this because I want the audience to understand the pressure that leaders are under, okay? You don't think about that enough, the pressure that leaders are under. So this political correctness stuff, you know, we need to have safe spaces on certain campuses for certain groups. That's a big one around the country. Well, last year, the University of Chicago, the president took that to court. And he said, we don't want to have safe spaces. We believe that our entire campus and the community should be a space for discussions, freedom of expression, exchange of ideas, et cetera. And the president won in court. So for his campus, then, this notion of safe spaces. When I was at NC State, there's a tunnel that leads from one side of campus to the other. Okay, they named it the Free Expression Tunnel. And students could go in that tunnel and write whatever they wanted on the walls of the tunnel. Well, I saw some of the ugliest homophobic and racist things I had ever seen in my life. And I thought I had seen them all. I saw some that were beyond what I could have conjured up, okay? And to me, it wasn't a safe space, okay? So you need to think about that. Leaders are confronted with racist, classist, sexist, homophobic symbols of things. Why do I have Liberty University there? Most of you know that Liberty University is a very Christian university. And Jerry Falwell founded it. And Jerry Falwell's son was running it until he came up with a big boo-boo recently. And it went out on social media where he had his zipper down, his pants open and something like that, standing next to a woman. So he resigned. But here's that's not the issue. Liberty has Confederate flags all through the campus, all right? Go back to that one where I talked about symbols. Remember I talked about symbols? When I said inclusion has to do with, do we have the right symbols that we're using? Well, Liberty symbols reflected a support for the Confederacy, a support for the lost cause argument of the Confederacy. And the lost cause argument, if you don't know about it, you need to know about it, states that slavery did not occur in a way that it historically is talked about in terms of brutalizing Black people, okay? So our track team, women's track especially, because 2 or 3 years before, I had decided we're gonna start women's track and we're gonna go to the Jamaica and the Bahamas and get our track stars. I said, I don't wanna wait 6 or 7 years to develop a female track. I said, I wanna win now, okay? So I told the women's track coach, I said, do you know what? You're the only coach among all the coaches of all sports that's gonna have a travel budget, because I want you to go to Jamaica and Bahamas and all those places and get me some sprinters. Well, what she did. All right, so the first big indoor, see, Liberty has a really nice indoor track. Liberty has a lot of money, a really nice indoor track. I refused to send the women's track team there with those racist Confederate symbols. Now, I received a lot of grief about that, but you have to take a position. And my position is I will never put my students, faculty even, in a situation where the symbols of that institution are clearly, obviously, racist, homophobic, etc. Okay. And I had to sit down and talk to the Jamaican and, students and from the Bahamas, etc., because they weren't exposed to that. They didn't understand that. All they want to do is run and win. Okay. So dealt with that, took care of that, etc. So there's a lot of things. Go down to the bullet that says accepting funding from controversial donors. The Koch brothers had started to provide support, financial support, to different institutions in the country, especially HBCUs. And they came to us and said, we want to give you $3 million for your business program. I said, and what does that mean? They said, well, we'll have a say in what courses are developed and we'll have a say in what speakers. I said, no, that's a responsibility of our faculty to do that. See, that was the trade-off. We're going to give you money if we can control the direction of your business school. And I said, no, that's not going to happen. Next one. Okay, remember I said we got to have the right questions. We got to ask the right questions, okay? And so I'm going to only select, for the next couple slides, I'm only going to select 1 or 2 because I'm running out of time and I want to leave time for questions. Look at the last bullet. How do we understand the contradictory interconnection between the democratic aspirations that people have, especially groups that haven't been included, they have democratic, and structural or systemic injustice, okay? How do we really articulate that in a way at University of Houston Clear Lake that it becomes part of your thought discussions, that we don't want a student to leave here and not understand that point, okay? That disenfranchised groups have democratic aspirations like everyone else, but the structural and systemic injustices are the things that keep them from being included. Next one. Again, questions, what kind of intercultural competencies did you want your graduates to have when they leave? Okay, just state what they are, show how they're going to get them, etc. They must have intercultural competencies to move into a diverse workplace, okay, to be included in a way that's functional. Next one. Oh, here's one. Sometimes in talking about strategies, people ask me, what are strategies we can use? Well, I say use the data that's out there. For example, here's some of the data on sexual and gender minorities who are crime victims. And just read some of those. I'm not going to go through them. My point is, why not give students this data in a class and say, in different disciplines, my discipline is psychology, what do you think the psychological aspects are that produce this kind of data. Okay, for people who practice violence, for people who rob gay and transgender folks, why does that happen? What are the psychological origins? If I was in business, what's the economic implications of this? You know, see, different disciplines could approach it different ways, but here's the data. Okay, so one of the things I'll suggest to faculty is that you come up with information like this to be able to have the dialogue, that's the controversial dialogue, but the dialogue is going to be based on evidence. See, that's different than dialogue based upon some freelancing discussion on your campus. Okay, look at that one down there. 29 LGBT members were killed in 2020. Most were Black and Latina transgendered women. Why is that the case? What is it about Black and Latina transgendered women that causes them to be murdered more than any other group in terms of sexual orientation? That's a critical question. All right, next one. And finally, in terms of outcomes, again, when we think about diversity outcomes, the ones that are going to have most impact intellectually are the ones that involve deep learning. Linda Susskind was one of the real good thinkers who started talking about deep learning 20 years ago. And now we're at that point where we really should understand what she was talking about. So deep learning means any of these things that are on here. But intellectually, look at the second and third one. You're comfortable with ambiguity and conflict because you know how to handle it intellectually. You have the ability to analyze and understand persuasive arguments, even when the arguments are wrong. So I tell people, hey, I listen to Rush Limbaugh all the time because I want to hear the arguments that he uses for the conservative platform. And then I sit back and analyze those arguments and then come up with my counter arguments for a lot of what he says. Okay, so you have different outcomes here on this slide. And later on, I think the last group I meet with, Kevin, is going to have a student panel. So that last box, inclusion of the voice of students, is critical in this discussion. You can't leave students out as you're formulating what you're going to do for the future. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. Questions?
Okay. Incredible. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. I would like to ask those of you that have questions to load them in the Q&A box while those are loading up. Dr. Anderson, I have a question to kind of start us off. Obviously, University of Houston Clear Lake is a public regional university. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about what our role is compared to like an R1 university, a large flagship state university. What do you see as the unique differences in what we do with our communities, and how, what are the subtle differences and the important differences that you see between an institution like ourselves and a larger R1?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, let's compare you to University of Texas at Austin, but I can't use them because they are historically have been big proponents of supporting diversity and affirmative action, things like that. So let's take a Texas A&M or University of Texas at Arlington or something like that. Those institutions tend to see themselves as elite institutions who deal with research issues, research questions, writing grants, et cetera, and who bring a certain kind of student there who is going to buy into the culture of that institution. Mid-sized regional institutions like yours are supposed to be, maybe they're not, but they're supposed to be institutions that address issues like diversity throughout all the areas of the institution, not just enrollment, okay, but inclusion and participation in different organizations, inclusion and decision-making, et cetera. Moreover, regional institutions, because they're regional and public, must address issues, must take their capital, their intellectual capital, and be able to apply it to communities that surround that institution. A lot of research institutions don't do that.
Great, thank you. Well, let's move to a few questions that have now surfaced in the Q&A box. I'll start off with the most recent. Dr. Anderson, it states, this is from a faculty member, when can I feel that I am stressing too much on the intercultural competency among my students, especially the more engineering and technical related?
Yeah. To that person, let me say, please watch the next presentation, okay? Because I'm going to talk a lot about things like that for faculty. But let me just say offhand is that this is why you not only ask for student feedback, but you expose yourself to things that are associated with your discipline that other institutions are doing really, really well. And their faculty will probably be able to tell you, if you read journal articles, if you read other kind of articles, they'll be able to tell you what they're doing and when it works and when it doesn't work. So exposure to engineering, I'm going to talk a little bit about engineering in the next session. Because again, see, I like that question because it's the opposite of the one I asked. The one I asked was, about students not doing well. But he says, okay, I'm going to include stuff. How do I know when I'm doing too much? Okay, and I'm going to give two examples, one from biology and one from chemistry, about faculty members and what they do.
Wonderful. Lisa, do you want to read the next question, please?
Yes, I have one for you, Dr. Anderson. Thank you. Thank you for acknowledging the importance of making room for ambiguity. How long should ambiguity hold? At some point, must we not come to a resolution? How do we know when it's time to do so?
When you say we, who's the we you're talking about?
I'm assuming the institution as a whole.
That's what I would interpret it as, yes.
Okay. This is why when you set your questions up and your outcomes are going to dictate how long something is. Okay. If you have outcomes that address long-term issues, it's going to take longer. If you have outcomes that address short-term issues, like there's something, see the example I gave of the Jewish students and the Muslim students, that was an issue, that was a short-term issue. And the ambiguity that existed was it didn't seem like either group understood what was going on. Moreover, before I got there, the university didn't understand what was going on, okay? So they didn't, if you don't understand what's going on, you don't understand how long it's going to take to resolve it. So that's why the suggestion that we use a debate format, which is something that most campuses have, they have debate teams, et cetera, worked in the short term. Because remember that thing I said, you drag it along. What things exist that can drag along what we want to do? Well, debate existed. And what we found was that other organizations now began to use the debate format for ambiguous and troublesome questions that they had and issues. And again, it's long-term versus short-term. Okay, you're in the petrochemical corridor. How about the national issue that most petrochemical spills are in poor communities? And not only are they in poor communities, but the children and the adults, et cetera, can show infirmities like cancer as a result of those petrochemical spills. Well, that's going to be a long-term response to that, okay? I don't know why people seem to be ambiguous about that. We have the same issue here in North Carolina with Gen X, which is runoff from these companies into the water. And then the water, rivers and ponds, et cetera, become groundwater that people utilize in their wells. So I don't understand why. Thank you for the question.
So in shifting just a tad bit, we have a question about community college. So how does a faculty liaison of, I'm assuming it is diversity, equity, and inclusion, look at a community college? What would be their responsibility?
Well, again, a good thing to do is look at some best models and practices. And I can, of the 350 institutions I've worked with, 150, 180 were community colleges, okay? Big ones like Miami-Dade, small ones too. North Harris Community College in Texas is big, expansive community college. I work with them. Community colleges, you have to understand, don't have students for a long time, okay? They also have more non-traditional students. So you have to think about that as you're thinking about this. What can I do to really impact them in 2 years, 2.5 years? Some of them stop out, drop out, et cetera. What can I do? I got to take all that into account as I think about taking the same kind of outcome I want at a 4-year institution and converting it to a 2-year institution, okay? And most community colleges struggle with that. They really do.
All right. Here's a question that is, I think, a particularly good one. Dr. Anderson, it states, how do you propose we deal with faculty and staff who show no interest or even have a negative attitude towards diversity, equity, and inclusion programs on campus?
Okay, Lisa and Kevin, remember we talked before, I said, don't ask me political questions. That's a political.
Okay, okay, fair
Oh,
enough.
oh, no, because each campus has a different response to that.
Right.
But that's a political question and has a lot to do with faculty governance and, P&T, promotion and tenure, and a lot of other things. The general answer is, why don't you reward them? Why don't you, for example, go to NC State's website and look up inquiry guided learning, IGL. Just put IGL in the search box, or inquiry guided learning. We felt that in order for students to handle ambiguity, Lisa, we have to give them the tools to do it. And those tools should be represented in all disciplines. So we wrote 2 grants. We wrote a grant to the Hewlett Foundation, got funded, and a second grant got funded, which almost never happens with Hewlett. And what we said in those was that we want to give the students the tools to deal with certain. Well, to give students the tools, faculty have to know how to teach inquiry guided learning, right? So we were able through the grant to support them financially as they did it. We told them, we want you to identify one graduate student that works with you to also go through this training process. Guess what happened? The faculty on their own from all of this developed an identity called the Hewlett Fellows. The Hewlett Fellows became the most revered organization to belong to on campus. And one of the things we did in that training was we had faculty from different disciplines work together. So an engineering faculty member worked with an art faculty member. Somebody in psychology worked with somebody in business. And they talked about and developed different strategies that approach it. But the general answer, Lisa, is, come up with some kind of reward system for them.
Thank you. We have time for just one more question. So, and you can determine if it's political or not, but I wanted to ask the question with regard to safe speech. What would you say to those like Van Jones who say that the job of a university is to prepare students for a life that isn't always paid for them?
Safe speech and free expression are really difficult topics, okay? Because they're amendment protected, right? First Amendment protections, but they're great sources of controversy and ambiguity that a faculty member should be allowed to utilize, okay? Now, you'll see in the next session, I think, I talk about faculty members, should you give trigger warnings to students if you're gonna cover something? So when I taught a psychology of women course, okay, years ago, and the reason I taught it was because no women in the department wanted to teach it. And this was a 25-person department and no woman wanted to teach it. And the students were clamoring for it. So I went to different psychology gatherings and learned how to teach psychology of women. But half of my first talk that day was about what I could and could not represent in talking about the psychology of women. I said, I can give you factual information. I can talk about theories that people propose. However, I cannot represent the social psychological reality of women. And I will not attempt to do that, okay? So in essence, and then I asked them, I said, at the end of every lecture, tell me if I've done something that offended you as a student, whether a male or female student. In this discussion, see, I asked for feedback from the students. I said, tell me if I've done something that offended you, or I should have given you a trigger warning for, etc. So it's not always that you can't use free expression. You can't include free expression in controversial things. It's that you got to prepare the students for it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. Dr. Wooden, did you have something you wanted to say?
We're getting close to the end of our time this morning. I don't see that there's another question to be answered. So I want to thank you, Dr. Anderson, for the incredible wisdom that you've been able to share and the questions that you've posed and the manner in which you've posed them to help us frame out what we need to think about very, very thoroughly and very critically. Thank you so much. Before, we're going to take a very brief intermission between now and 10:30. We will segue into the next segment, which is an educator's workshop. But before I do, again, thank you, Lisa, for all that you've done to help move this program along. And thank you, Reggie Jones, and thank you, Lori Lopez, for all your assistance. So we're going to take a brief intermission, and we'll be back in about 1 minute. Okay, thank you.